June 4th, 1940. Winston Churchill stood in the House of Commons, gripping the edges of the podium. The atmosphere in the chamber was thick, with a strange mixture of exhaustion and hysteria. Just days earlier, the British military establishment had been preparing for the total annihilation of their professional army. They had expected to lose everything on the beaches of northern France. Instead, a miracle had happened. Over 338,000 Allied troops had been plucked from the jaws of the German war machine and brought back across the English Channel. The mood in the country was bordering on euphoric. People were calling it a victory. They were calling it the miracle of Dunkirk. But Churchill knew something the cheering crowds did not. He knew the terrifying reality of what actually sat in the barracks and depots of Britain that morning. As he looked out at the faces of the members of Parliament, he delivered one of the most famous speeches in the English language, vowing to fight on the beaches and landing grounds. But right in the middle of that defiance, he said something that cut through the celebration like a knife. He said, "Wars are not won by evacuations." It was a splash of cold water, a warning. Because while the public saw a heroic rescue, Churchill saw a strategic nightmare that had only just begun. The rescue had saved the men, yes, but it hadn't saved the war. In fact, in many ways, it had left Britain more vulnerable than it had ever been in its history. In this video, we are going to look at exactly what Churchill said, and more importantly, what he thought, when the Dunkirk evacuation concluded. We aren't just looking at the famous sound bites. We are looking at the private relief, the terrifying realization of Britain's weakness, and the cold calculation he made about the future of the war. You've heard the speech. But you probably haven't heard the story of what happened when the microphones were turned off, and the Prime Minister sat down with his generals to count the cost of survival. Because on that day in June, saving the army didn't mean they were safe. It just meant they had the chance to die on British soil instead of French soil. And Churchill knew it. To understand why Churchill's reaction was so complex, you have to understand just how close Britain came to losing everything. We look back at Dunkirk now through the lens of history, knowing they got away. But in late May 1940, nobody thought that was possible. The British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, was the only professional, fully trained army Britain had, and it was trapped. The German panzer divisions had sliced through France with a speed that modern military commanders still study today. They had pushed the British forces into a tiny pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The initial estimates were catastrophic. When the operation to evacuate them, codenamed Operation Dynamo, began, the naval experts told Churchill to expect the worst. They estimated they could save perhaps 45,000 men. That was the ceiling. 45,000 out of nearly 400,000. Do the math on that. That meant the British government was preparing to announce the loss or capture of over 90% of its army. If that had happened, the war would have effectively ended right there. Without an army, Britain couldn't defend its own coastline. Churchill wouldn't be making speeches about fighting on the beaches. He would be negotiating terms of surrender, or watching a German puppet government take power in London. The stakes weren't just about winning a battle. They were about the continued existence of an independent Britain. So when the operation concluded, and the final count came in at 338, 226 men saved, the relief in the War Cabinet was overwhelming. It defied all logic. It defied all military probability. But here is the critical point that Churchill grasped immediately. Saving the soldiers was not the same as saving the army's fighting power. You can have 300,000 men, but if they are disorganized, demoralized, and unarmed, they aren't a fighting force. They are just a crowd. Churchill looked at the numbers and he saw a reprieve, not a triumph. He knew that Hitler was now staring across the Channel, looking at a Britain that had its men back but had left its shield in France. The miracle of Dunkirk had bought time, but it hadn't bought safety. And as the euphoria swept the nation, Churchill had the unenviable job of being the one man in the room who had to ask, "So, what do we fight with now?" Before we dive into the specific catastrophe of the equipment loss, I want to be clear about where this information comes from. We aren't relying on movies or dramatizations here. The insights into Churchill's mindset and the reactions of the British High Command come directly from the War Cabinet papers, the personal diaries of men like General Alan Brooke, and Churchill's own extensive memoirs. These documents paint a picture of a leadership group that was oscillating wildly between relief and terror. It's easy to get swept up in the romantic image of the little ships, the civilian boats crossing the channel, and that was real and it was heroic. But the documents reveal a much colder, harder reality behind the scenes. Churchill was receiving intelligence reports detailing exactly what the Germans were doing with the positions the British had abandoned. He was reading reports on the state of the returned troops. He wasn't just a cheerleader. He was a warlord analyzing a balance sheet that was deep in the red. This duality is key to understanding what Churchill said in June 1940. Publicly, he had to be the British bulldog. He had to project invincible confidence to keep the morale of the country from collapsing and, crucially, to convince the Americans that Britain was worth supporting. If he showed even a hint of the panic that was discussed in closed sessions, American support would have dried up instantly. President Roosevelt was watching closely, trying to decide if sending weapons to Britain was a good investment or just throwing good money after bad. So when you hear Churchill's famous words, remember that they were a calculated performance. They were true in spirit, but they hid a terrifying lack of capability. He was bluffing the world. He was bluffing Hitler. And to an extent, he was bluffing his own people. He knew that if the Germans launched an invasion immediately in June or July of 1940, the saved army would have been fighting with little more than rifles and Molotov cocktails. Stay with me, because later in this video I'm going to share a specific, private admission Churchill made that shows just how thin the line between survival and ruin really was. Let's look at the mechanics of the miracle itself, because it sets the stage for the disaster of the equipment. The evacuation at Dunkirk wasn't an organized withdrawal. It was a chaotic scramble for survival. You had hundreds of thousands of men queuing on a narrow mole, a breakwater wall, waiting for destroyers to pull alongside. You had men wading up to their necks in water, waiting for those famous little ships to ferry them out to the larger transports. The discipline held, which is a testament to the British soldier, but the infrastructure of an army cannot survive that kind of exit. You cannot load a heavy tank onto a pleasure cruiser. You cannot drive an artillery piece onto a fishing boat. The priority was flesh and blood. Every decision made on those beaches was a binary choice. Save the man or save the machine. And the decision, rightly, was always to save the man. General Lord Gort, the commander of the BEF, made the call that the only thing that mattered was getting the personnel back. This meant that, as the queues moved forward into the water, they were walking past the abandoned carcass of a modern military force. Trucks were disabled and left in rows. Tanks were spiked or driven into canals. Piles of ammunition, fuel, and supplies were set on fire or simply left for the Germans. Imagine being a soldier in that line. You are exhausted. You haven't slept in days. You are being strafed by the Luftwaffe. And you are walking past the very weapons you rely on to keep you alive. You are leaving your protection behind. When those men arrived in Dover or Ramsgate, they were alive, but they were stripped bare. They carried their personal rifles, maybe a few rounds of ammunition, and the clothes on their backs. Many didn't even have that. They arrived barefoot, wrapped in blankets. Churchill watched the reports of the arrivals. He saw the numbers climbing, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000. But he also saw the reports from the quartermaster general, and those reports were the stuff of nightmares. The men were back, but the army, as a fighting entity capable of waging modern war, was effectively gone. It had been left on the sands of Dunkirk. This brings us to the conflict that defined Churchill's reaction. The relief of getting the men back was instantly crushed by the weight of what they had lost. The statistics of the equipment abandoned at Dunkirk are staggering, and they are often overlooked, in the retelling of the story. The British Expeditionary Force left behind two 472 heavy guns. These weren't just pistols. These were the artillery pieces needed to stop tanks. They left behind nearly 64,000 vehicles, trucks, transport wagons, motorcycles. They left behind 20,000 motorcycles alone. They abandoned over 400,000 tons of stores and ammunition. To put that in perspective, when the evacuation was over, the British Army in England had hardly any anti-tank guns. In the entire country, there were only about 500 field guns remaining to defend the whole island against the Wehrmacht. If a German panzer division had managed to land on the coast of Kent in July 1940, there was almost nothing heavy enough to stop it. The British troops would have been throwing grenades at tanks. Churchill knew this. When he said, quote, 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 "Wars are not won by evacuations," he was explicitly referencing this loss. He was telling the House of Commons, and the military command, that getting the men back was only half the equation. An army without guns is just a group of targets. The Royal Air Force had lost over 100 aircraft covering the evacuation. The destroyers of the Royal Navy had been battered and sunk. The victory of Dunkirk had stripped Britain naked. Churchill's reaction was one of frantic urgency. He immediately ordered a crash program of production. He ordered the defense of the island to be organized using whatever was at hand: museum pieces, sporting rifles, pikes if necessary. The relief of saving the men transformed instantly into the terror of arming them. He realized that while he had saved the soul of the army, he had lost its body, and he had to rebuild it before Hitler realized just how defenseless they really were. So we have a prime minister who knows his army is back but broken. He knows his coast is undefended. And he knows the British public is treating this like a massive football victory. This brings us to the moment of the speech itself, on June 4th. This is where Churchill had to thread the most difficult needle of his political life. He had to praise the heroism of the rescue without validating the catastrophe of the defeat. When he stood up in the House of Commons, he didn't start with the famous "fight them on the beaches" line. He started with a cold, hard summary of the military disaster. He detailed the breakdown of the French front. He detailed the loss of the equipment. And then he dropped the line that acts as the fulcrum of the entire event. He said, "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." That statement is the key to understanding Churchill's mind. It was a deliberate attempt to puncture the balloon of euphoria before it floated away into complacency. He was terrified that the British people would think the war was over, or that the danger had passed. He had to tell them, "We ran away. We did it well, but we ran away. And now the enemy is at the door." But he did something else in that speech that was purely strategic. He framed the evacuation not just as a survival story, but as a demonstration of maritime power. He emphasized that the Air Force, the RAF, had successfully battled the Luftwaffe over the Channel. Why did he focus on that? Because he knew the next phase of the war would be the Battle of Britain. He needed the public to believe that their pilots could beat German pilots. He was managing the psychology of a nation that was about to be bombed. If he had just said, "We lost all our guns and we are hiding on our island," the government might have fallen. Instead, he said, "We have proven we can extract our men from the jaws of death, and we have proven we can control the air over the Channel." He turned a retreat into a proof of concept for defense. But privately, he knew that concept was about to be tested to the breaking point. And as we'll see in the next chapter, his private plans for that defense were far darker than anything he admitted in public. While Churchill was publicly promising to fight on the landing grounds, privately he was authorizing plans that showed just how desperate the situation really was. This is the part of the Dunkirk story that often gets left out of the history books, because it's uncomfortable. It reveals that the British government was considering measures that would have changed the moral complexion of the war entirely. With the army stripped of its heavy weapons, Churchill and his advisors knew they couldn't stop a German panzer division in a conventional battle on English soil. If the Germans landed, they would likely break through the coastal defenses. So what was the plan? It wasn't just fighting with pikes, as Churchill joked to the press. It was total war in the most literal sense. Churchill gave orders to prepare for the use of chemical weapons, mustard gas. He was prepared to drench the beaches of southern England in gas if the Wehrmacht established a beachhead. He famously wrote in a private memo that if the Germans landed, they should be made to, quote, choke in their own blood. This wasn't rhetoric. The stocks of gas were checked. The delivery systems were reviewed. This reveals the true stakes of the post-Dunkirk reality. Churchill wasn't just a defiant leader standing on a rock. He was a cornered commander willing to burn the house down to kill the intruder. He also authorized the creation of the auxiliary units, secret squads of civilians trained to stay behind enemy lines if Britain was occupied. Their job wasn't to win battles. It was to assassinate German officers and blow up railways. They had a life expectancy of about 12 days. This is the depth of the crisis Churchill saw. The miracle of Dunkirk hadn't solved the problem of invasion. It had just moved the battlefield to the English suburbs. When you hear him speak about never surrendering, you have to understand that he was envisioning a scenario of guerrilla warfare, gas attacks, and fighting street by street through London. He wasn't thinking about a glorious victory parade. He was thinking about making the conquest of Britain so painful that Hitler would choke on it. But there was one other audience for his speech, one other hope he was clinging to, which we need to uncover next. There is a specific sentence at the very end of the June 4th speech that acts as a pivot point for the rest of the war. Most people stopped listening after, "We shall never surrender." But Churchill didn't stop there. He continued with a sentence that was explicitly directed at one man, thousands of miles away, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Churchill said, "Until in God's good time, the New World, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old." This is the crucial admission hidden in the rhetoric. By June 1940, after the fall of France and the evacuation at Dunkirk, Churchill had come to a realization that defined his entire strategy for the next 18 months. He realized that the British Empire, alone, could not defeat Nazi Germany. They could survive. They could defend the island. They could bomb German cities. But they could not invade Europe and drive Hitler back to Berlin. They simply didn't have the manpower or the industrial capacity to do it alone. Dunkirk proved that. The British army was too small. The German war machine was too big. Churchill knew that the only way to win, not just not lose, but co-win, was to get the United States into the war. That final line of the speech was a distress signal wrapped in poetry. He was telling America, "We are still here. We are fighting. We aren't going to surrender and hand over our fleet to Hitler. But we can't finish this without you." This changed the war from a battle for territory into a battle for time. Churchill's goal post-Dunkirk wasn't to invade France. It was to hold on long enough for American public opinion to shift. Every speech, every decision, every act of defiance was calculated to show the Americans that Britain was a good bet. He was telling Roosevelt, "Invest in us. We won't fold." "The wars are not won by evacuations" line was also a message to the U.S. "We know we haven't won yet. We aren't delusional. Send guns." And as we know, that message was received. But the psychological impact on the British people themselves was just as important. The aftermath of Dunkirk created a psychological phenomenon that historians call the Dunkirk spirit. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but what did it actually mean for the people living through it? Strangely, the fall of France and the retreat from Dunkirk clarified the war for the British public. Before June 1940, the war was complex. It involved treaties, alliances with France, expeditionary forces, and distant maneuvers. After Dunkirk, it was simple. It was us versus them. We are on an island. They are over there. If they come here, we fight them. There was a strange, almost perverse sense of relief in the country. King George VI even wrote in a letter to his mother, "Personally, I feel happier now that we have no allies to be polite to and to pamper." Churchill tapped into this masterfully. He took the isolation of Britain, which strategically was a disaster, and turned it into a badge of honor. Being alone became a source of pride. The narrative shifted from, "We have been kicked out of Europe," to, "We are the last fortress of freedom." This mental shift was essential because the bombing was about to start. The Blitz would kill over 40,000 British civilians. If the population had felt defeated after Dunkirk, the morale might have cracked under the bombs. But because Churchill had framed Dunkirk as a deliverance and a prelude to a heroic defense, the British people felt they were part of a legendary last stand. They weren't victims. They were defenders. That shift in mindset, from victimhood to defiance, is arguably Churchill's greatest achievement in those few weeks. He used the miracle of Dunkirk to inoculate the population against the terror that was coming. But even with that spirit, the reality of the situation remained grim, leading us to our final conclusion about what that moment truly meant for history. So, what did Churchill really say when the Dunkirk rescue saved Britain's entire army? He said that survival is not victory. He said that relief is dangerous if it leads to complacency. And he said that the road ahead would require a level of sacrifice that the world had not yet seen. The miracle of Dunkirk was a tactical success that masked a strategic catastrophe. It saved 338,000 men, but it left Britain defending its island with little more than courage and bluff. Churchill's genius wasn't in organizing the boats. That was the Navy. His genius was in framing the narrative so that the British people saw the return of their army not as a prelude to surrender, but as the starting gun for the real war. He looked at a defeated, disarmed mob and saw the nucleus of the force that would one day return to liberate Europe. And he was right. 4 years later, almost to the day, British troops would return to the beaches of France on D-Day. But this time they wouldn't be leaving. They would be bringing the new world with them, just as Churchill had predicted in his darkest hour. And as promised, I want to leave you with one final piece of history. A specific note Churchill sent to his military chiefs during the evacuation. When discussing the possibility that a portion of the army might not get off the beach and might have to surrender, he wrote, "The nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished." That was the core of his belief. Dunkirk gave them the chance to go down fighting if necessary, and because they were willing to do that, they didn't go down at all.